Hey, welcome to Plot Tales Daily, dramatic Reddit stories with crazy endings? Then you're in the right channel. I'm on a mission to hit 1,000 subscribers, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Hit subscribe and join. It's free. You won't want to miss what story is coming next. I was falsely accused of SA. I wasn't even supposed to babysit that night. It was a last-minute thing, one of those situations where everyone assumes someone else will step up. My mom's friend, let's call her Mrs. J, called our house around 5 p.m. I was eating leftovers in the kitchen when my mom walked in and said, "Mrs. J's babysitter canceled. She asked if you'd help out tonight. Can you do it?" I remember asking why Mrs. J didn't just reschedule whatever plans she had. My mom rolled her eyes and said, "It's some charity auction thing and she already promised to go. She's in a bind and it won't kill you to help." I didn't really have anything going on, so I said yes. Besides, I figured babysitting wasn't exactly rocket science. Mrs. J's kids were pretty easygoing from what I remembered. I'd seen them a few times when she came over to visit my mom. They weren't the bratty type, just your average, energetic little kids. Mrs. J thanked me about 50 times when I got to her house. She was already dressed up, wearing a sequined dress and heels, like she was ready for the Oscars. She showed me where the snacks were, went over the bedtime routine, and then bolted out the door. The kids, who I'll call Tommy and Emma, were watching cartoons when I got there. They were glued to the screen, barely noticing me at first. I sat on the couch for a while, scrolling through my homework planner, trying to figure out how I was going to finish my math assignment before class on Monday. Tommy, the younger one, finally came up and asked if I'd play hide and seek. Emma joined in, and for the next hour, we ran around the house. They kept hiding in the same spots, the pantry, behind the curtains, under a blanket on the couch, but they were having fun, so I didn't call them out on it. When we were done, I made them dinner. I found some frozen chicken nuggets in the freezer and heated them up. Emma insisted on ketchup, and Tommy argued that ketchup was gross, so I ended up putting 2 bottles on the table, ketchup for Emma and ranch for Tommy. They ate in silence, focused like the chicken nuggets were some kind of gourmet meal. After dinner, we played a board game. It was one of those games where you roll dice and move little plastic pieces around a board. Emma kept trying to cheat, and Tommy kept calling her out. At one point, Emma stuck her tongue out at him and declared she was the queen of the house. Tommy didn't take that well, and I had to step in before it turned into a full-blown meltdown. When bedtime rolled around, they tried to stall. First, it was just 5 more minutes of TV. Then Emma said she needed to find her favorite stuffed animal before she could sleep. Tommy claimed he wasn't tired and wanted to stay up to guard the house. I let them each pick 1 book for a bedtime story, figuring that would calm them down. Emma chose a book about a magical cat, and Tommy picked something about dinosaurs. I read both books out loud, even though I could tell Emma was already half asleep by the time I finished hers. Tommy held out a little longer, asking me random questions about dinosaurs until his voice trailed off mid-sentence. Once they were both asleep, I cleaned up the living room, stacking the board game pieces neatly and wiping ketchup off the table. Then I parked myself on the couch and flipped through the channels. Mrs. J didn't have cable, just a bunch of DVDs stacked on a shelf. I ended up watching some nature documentary about penguins. The night was uneventful, to say the least. Around midnight, Mrs. J came home. She thanked me again, handed me $40, and told me I was a lifesaver. She didn't say much else, just that the kids would probably beg her to hire me again. I smiled, said goodnight, and walked home. It never crossed my mind that anything was wrong. Looking back, there wasn't a single moment that stood out as strange or unusual. Everything about that night was normal, completely and utterly normal. The morning after babysitting, I slept in. It was a Saturday and I didn't have any plans. I woke up to the sound of loud knocking on the front door, followed by my mom yelling my name from downstairs. "Come down here, it's the police!" I thought she was joking. I was groggy and half-dressed when I shuffled down the stairs, rubbing my eyes. There were 2 officers standing in the doorway, their expressions serious. My mom was in the kitchen, whispering to my dad. The officers asked if they could come inside, and before I could even say anything, they told me I was under arrest. They handcuffed me right there in my own living room. My mom gasped, and my dad came over demanding to know what was going on, but the officers just said it was related to an investigation. I didn't even get to ask questions before I was dragged outside and shoved into the back of a patrol car. The ride to the station was a blur. When we got there, they put me in a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a one-way mirror. They started asking me questions. If I knew Sarah, if I had been at Mrs. J's house the night before, if I had been alone with her. At first, I answered everything honestly, but then they started asking about the kids. The questions were disgusting, the kind of things that make your skin crawl. Did I touch them? Did I say anything inappropriate? Did I threaten them? I couldn't even believe what I was hearing. I told them no, over and over, but they kept pressing, asking me to be honest. Finally, one of them said Sarah had accused me of trying to force myself on her after the kids went to bed. She claimed I'd cornered her in the kitchen and made threats when she said no. She also said I had acted strange around the kids and insinuated that I'd done something to them too. I was stunned. None of this had happened. I hadn't even seen Sarah that night. She wasn't at the house while I was babysitting. I told the officers this, but they just stared at me like they didn't believe a word I was saying. When they finished interrogating me, they charged me and let me go on bail. I walked out of the station in a daze. My parents were waiting for me in the car, and the drive home was completely silent. That silence didn't last long. By the time we got home, my mom was crying and my dad was pacing the living room. "What the hell is this about?" my dad demanded. "Did you do it?" "Of course I didn't do it," I shouted back. I tried to explain everything, but they were both skeptical. My mom kept saying, "Why would Sarah make this up?" My dad just stared at me, arms crossed, like he was trying to read my mind. By the next day, word had spread. Someone must have seen me being arrested, and in a small town like ours, rumors don't just travel, they explode. Everywhere I went, people were whispering. Neighbors who used to wave at me suddenly wouldn't meet my eyes. A couple of days later, one of my friends stopped by to check in. I thought he was there to support me, but the first thing he asked was, "Did you really do it?" I told him no, but he just shook his head and said, "You know how it looks, right? Sarah's not the kind of person who would lie about this." That was the last time I heard from him. By the end of the week, I started getting calls from people I hadn't spoken to in months. Old classmates, distant relatives, even one of my teachers. None of them were calling to support me. They just wanted the gossip. "I heard you got arrested," they'd say, waiting for me to spill details. When I told them I was innocent, they'd say things like, "Well, I hope it works out for you," in that tone people use when they've already decided you're guilty. The worst part was my family. My younger brother avoided me entirely. My older sister came over to talk, but it wasn't a friendly visit. She sat me down and said, "I don't know what to believe, but if there's even a chance you did this." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. I moved out a few days later. My parents didn't tell me to leave, but the tension in the house was unbearable. My mom would cry every time she saw me, and my dad stopped talking to me altogether. I packed a duffel bag and left without saying much. I stayed with a friend for a couple of nights, but it was obvious he was uncomfortable. He kept making excuses to leave the house, and when I asked if I could stay longer, he told me his landlord didn't allow long-term guests. I knew he was lying, but I didn't push it. I ended up renting a cheap room from an older couple who didn't ask too many questions. They were nice enough, but I could tell they'd heard the rumors. The wife would glance at me nervously whenever I walked into the kitchen, and the husband made a point of keeping the conversations short. Meanwhile, Sarah's story was gaining traction. People started coming forward saying they'd always thought I was weird or too quiet. Every mistake I'd ever made was suddenly evidence of my guilt. My life wasn't just falling apart, it was being torn apart piece by piece. By the time the trial rolled around, my entire life felt like it had been flipped upside down and lit on fire. I walked into the courthouse with a public defender I barely knew, wearing a suit I borrowed from my uncle because I couldn't afford one. The courtroom was packed, mostly people I recognized from town. The same people who used to smile at me at the grocery store or wave at me at church were now there to watch the show. The prosecution came in swinging, painting me as some predator who had abused his position of trust. Sarah sat in the witness stand with her hair neatly tied back, wearing a plain sweater, looking as innocent and helpless as possible. When she started her testimony, her voice cracked like she'd been holding back tears all day. She told the court that I had cornered her in Mrs. J's kitchen that night after the kids went to bed, that I made her uncomfortable and afraid to say no. Then she added the part about the kids, saying she didn't want to believe I had done anything to them but couldn't ignore how they had acted differently since that night. It was complete fiction, but the way she spoke, you'd think she had memorized a script written by the prosecution. I sat there, gripping the edge of the defense table, trying not to react. My lawyer whispered, "Stay calm." But it was impossible to stay calm when someone was tearing your life apart in front of everyone you'd ever known. The prosecution paraded a few more witnesses, all people I barely knew who suddenly had concerns about me. One guy claimed I'd been too friendly with the kids at a 4th of July barbecue a year before. Another woman said she always got a bad feeling about me when I walked past her house. None of it had any basis in reality, but it didn't matter. The jury was eating it up. When it was our turn, my lawyer tried his best. He showed the court the ring camera footage from Mrs. J's house, which clearly proved I never left the living room after the kids went to bed. But the prosecution argued that the footage wasn't complete, that it didn't cover every angle, and didn't disprove the allegations. Then my phone records were presented. They showed I'd been texting my friend during the exact time Sarah claimed I was in the kitchen with her. Again, the prosecution found a way to dismiss it, saying I could have been texting while committing the crime. The jury nodded along like this made perfect sense. My lawyer called Mrs. J as a witness, and she testified that the kids hadn't said anything unusual about me when she got home that night. She even told the court she trusted me enough to watch her kids again. But by then, it was too late. The damage was already done. When it came time for me to testify, I thought maybe I could turn things around. I told the truth, everything that happened that night exactly as it happened. I told them how I'd played board games with the kids, made them dinner, read them bedtime stories, and stayed in the living room until Mrs. J got home. I told them I never saw Sarah that night, but the prosecutor was relentless. He grilled me on every detail, trying to trip me up. "Why do you think Sarah would lie?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Isn't it convenient that the only footage you have doesn't show the kitchen? What do you say to the people in town who claim they always knew something was off about you?" Every answer I gave felt like digging myself into a deeper hole. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, I could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom on me, silently accusing. The kids didn't testify in person. Instead, the prosecution played a video of an interview they'd done with some child psychologist. In the video, the psychologist asked leading questions like, "Did my name ever make you feel uncomfortable? And did he touch you in a way you didn't like?" The kids were visibly confused, shrugging and looking at each other for answers. But the psychologist kept pressing until Tommy hesitated and said, "Maybe." That single word felt like a hammer coming down on my head. When the closing arguments came, the prosecution talked about trust, how parents trusted babysitters to protect their kids, how predators used that trust to hide in plain sight. They looked at me like I was the personification of evil, and the jury hung on to every word. My lawyer tried to focus on the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. He pointed out the inconsistencies in Sarah's story and the fact that none of the physical evidence backed up her claims. But his words felt small compared to the emotional impact of Sarah's testimony and the kids' video. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they came back with the guilty verdict, I didn't react. Not because I wasn't shocked, but because I physically couldn't. My legs wouldn't move, my mouth wouldn't open. I just stood there, frozen, as the judge sentenced me to 4 years in prison. Behind me, I heard my mom sobbing. My dad didn't say a word. I didn't turn around to look at them. I couldn't. The bailiff came over and cuffed me. As I was led out of the courtroom, I glanced at Sarah. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't even pretending to be upset. She just sat there, staring straight ahead like she had already moved on. Prison isn't something you can prepare for, no matter how many movies you've watched or stories you've heard. The first day, the smell alone hit me. Bleach, sweat, and something metallic I couldn't place. The guards moved us through processing like cattle, barking instructions I barely understood. I was handed a jumpsuit, a pair of shoes, and a scratchy blanket, then shoved into a cell with a guy who didn't bother looking up from his book when I walked in. I kept to myself that first night. I sat on the bottom bunk staring at the wall, trying to make sense of how I went from babysitting 2 kids to this hellhole. The noises never stopped. Banging, yelling, the occasional laugh echoing down the corridor. My cellmate snored like a chainsaw, but at least he didn't talk to me. The next morning, I learned how things worked. There was no warm welcome, no orientation. You figure it out by watching and, if you're lucky, keeping your head down. I wasn't lucky. By lunch, someone had already whispered about why I was there. "That's the kid toucher," one guy said, loud enough for everyone to hear. It didn't take long for the harassment to start. A shove in the chow line, someone tripping me in the yard, a wad of spit landing on my tray during dinner. I ignored it, kept my mouth shut, but that only made it worse. On the third day, a guy in the laundry room grabbed me by the collar and slammed me into a row of lockers. "We don't like your kind here," he said. His breath smelled like stale cigarettes. I didn't fight back, which only encouraged him. He threw a punch that split my lip open, and when I hit the ground, he kicked me twice in the ribs for good measure. I limped back to my cell, wiping the blood off my face with my sleeve. My cellmate glanced at me and said, "You're gonna have to hit back or they'll keep coming." I didn't answer him. I didn't trust anyone. Over the next few weeks, I learned how to survive. I kept my head down, ate fast, and stayed out of the way. But no matter how much I tried to blend in, the label stuck. Baby raper. Chomo. They said it loud and often, making sure I couldn't forget. The guards weren't any better. They didn't physically attack me, but they didn't stop the inmates who did either. One of them smirked when he saw me limping across the yard after a fight. "Looks like you made a friend," he said. The fights came often. Sometimes it was a sucker punch in the shower. Other times it was a group cornering me in the hallway. I learned to throw punches even if I didn't win. One guy broke my nose during a brawl in the yard, and another gave me a black eye that lasted for weeks. I started working out, partly to defend myself and partly because it was something to do. Lifting weights gave me a sense of control, even if it was just for an hour a day. It also kept me out of the common areas, where the stares and whispers followed me like a shadow. The nights were the worst. The noise wasn't as bad after lockdown, but the silence was heavier. My mind wouldn't shut up, replaying the trial, Sarah's face, the moment the cuffs clicked around my wrists. Sometimes I thought about my family and whether they even thought about me. I got one letter from my mom a few months in. She said she hoped I was doing okay and that she was praying for me. She didn't say she believed me. She didn't even say she loved me. My dad never wrote. My siblings didn't either. I stopped waiting for mail after the first year. Holidays were brutal. The other inmates talked about their families, the kids they hadn't seen in years. I didn't join those conversations. What was I supposed to say? That my family thought I was a monster? One Christmas, the prison chaplain handed out cookies and tiny Bibles. I kept the cookie, tossed the Bible, and went back to my cell. My cellmate was gone by then. He'd been transferred, so I ate the cookie alone, staring out the small window at the gray sky. I was transferred to a different block halfway through my sentence. At first, I thought it might be better, but it wasn't. The guards warned the new inmates about me before I even stepped foot in the yard. "Keep your distance from the chomo," one of them said. That made me an easy target. One night, two guys jumped me in the showers. They didn't just want to hurt me, they wanted to humiliate me. I fought back as hard as I could, landing a punch square in one guy's jaw, but the other one got me from behind. I woke up in the infirmary with stitches across my forehead and a cracked tooth. The infirmary nurse didn't ask what happened. She just handed me a bottle of ibuprofen and told me to take it easy. By the time I was released, I had a permanent limp from an ankle injury that never healed right. My nose was crooked from being broken so many times, and my left ear was slightly misshapen from a fight that ended with someone smashing a tray over my head. But the physical scars weren't the worst. The worst was walking out of that gate knowing I wasn't the same person who had walked in. I didn't know who I was anymore, but I knew the label would follow me forever. Getting out of prison wasn't as simple as walking out the gates and leaving it all behind. My new lawyer, a guy with more energy than I'd seen in years, had already been working on my case for months before I was released. He wasn't like the public defender from my trial. This guy had fire in his belly and something to prove. It started with a stack of evidence he found in the original case files, most of which had been ignored or outright dismissed. He brought me into his office the week after I was released on bail. I sat in a chair that was too nice for me to feel comfortable in while he laid out everything on the table, literally and figuratively. The ring camera footage, he said, should have been a slam dunk. The timestamps clearly showed I never left the living room all night, and there wasn't a single frame of Sarah at the house. Then there was the GPS data from my phone, which put me exactly where I said I was, sitting on the couch texting my friend about what a mess the kids had made with ketchup. He even found gaps in Sarah's timeline that didn't add up, claims she made that contradicted her original police statement. The most shocking part was what he found about the kids' testimonies. He had them reevaluated by a forensic psychologist who specialized in cases like mine. The psychologist said it was clear the kids had been coached. Their answers in the original interview were inconsistent, and the leading questions asked by the interviewer might as well have planted the accusations for them. When the day came to present all of this to the court, I walked in feeling like I was staring down the barrel of a gun. The courtroom was quieter this time, fewer spectators, but Sarah was there. She sat in the same spot, wearing the same innocent mask she'd worn during the first trial. My lawyer went to work, pulling apart her story piece by piece. He played the ring camera footage for the judge, freezing it at key moments to point out the lack of evidence. He showed the phone records, circling the timestamps in red ink on a printed chart. When he brought up the psychologist's findings, the judge leaned forward like he was finally paying attention. Sarah's face started to change as the questioning turned to her. She stumbled over answers, repeating herself, claiming she'd remembered things differently since the first trial. Then my lawyer asked her directly, "Why did you lie?" She froze. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny it again, to double down and keep this nightmare going. But then she broke. She admitted she hadn't been there that night. She said she was angry at her mom for not hiring her and thought accusing me would teach her a lesson. The courtroom went so quiet you could hear the judge's pen scratching against the paper. I didn't look at anyone, not the judge, not my lawyer, not even my family, who I knew were sitting somewhere in the back. I kept my eyes on Sarah, watching as she dug herself deeper. When the judge announced the charges were overturned, I didn't feel relief. Not right away. It felt like standing in the middle of a tornado, everything spinning around me while I just stood there, waiting for it to stop. My lawyer shook my hand and said something about justice being served. The judge ordered Sarah to be taken into custody for perjury, but none of it felt real. I walked out of the courthouse on autopilot, barely noticing the sun on my face or the people watching from the steps. My mom tried to catch up with me outside. She called my name, her voice shaking, but I kept walking. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire again, but this time it was about me being innocent. People started coming out of the woodwork to apologize. My old boss called to say he always had faith in me, which was a lie because he fired me the second I was arrested. A neighbor left cookies on my doorstep with a note that said, "We're sorry." I threw the note away and gave the cookies to a stray dog I'd seen around the neighborhood. The hardest part was figuring out what to do next. I couldn't just go back to the life I had before. There was nothing left of it. No job, no friends, no trust in anyone. My lawyer suggested I sue Sarah, and I agreed without hesitation. She stole 4 years of my life. Someone had to answer for that. The civil case wasn't about the money for me, it was about making her face what she'd done. My lawyer said it would take time, but I didn't care. I had all the time in the world now. Rebuilding wasn't easy. I kept running into people who had been quick to believe the worst about me. Some apologized. Others avoided me altogether, too ashamed to face me. I didn't care about their excuses. I didn't care about their guilt. What mattered was that I was free, finally free, and for the first time in years, the truth was on my side. Update 1. Hey everyone, I wasn't expecting the post to blow up like it did. I've been reading through the comments and I appreciate the support more than I can say. A lot of you asked what happened after I got out, so here's where things stand now. The first thing I did when I got back to town was find somewhere to stay. I couldn't go back to my parents' house, not after everything. They didn't kick me out this time, but the tension was unbearable. My mom kept asking if I'd forgive her, like she was trying to tie it all up in a neat little bow. My dad, who barely said a word throughout the whole thing, just sat there staring at the TV while she tried to apologize. I ended up crashing with an old coworker for a couple of weeks. He wasn't one of the people who abandoned me, but we hadn't exactly stayed in touch while I was locked up. He let me stay on his couch though, and didn't ask too many questions. Still, there were moments where I could tell he wasn't sure what to say. Once, while we were eating dinner, he blurted out, "So, like, what do you even do now?" Good question. The town wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for me. I went to the grocery store a few days after getting back, and the cashier wouldn't even look me in the eye. A woman in the next aisle pointed me out to her husband and whispered something. I didn't stick around to hear the rest. Even with the charges overturned, people weren't quick to let go of their suspicions. Someone slashed my tires one night. Another time, a neighbor left an anonymous note in my mailbox that said, "We don't want you here." My mom called me the day after the tire slashing incident, crying on the phone about how sorry she was. "I didn't know what to think back then," she said, over and over like a broken record. She kept asking if we could meet up, but I wasn't ready for that yet. My sister reached out too. She said she'd been struggling with guilt ever since the truth came out. We met at a coffee shop and she apologized for not standing by me during the trial. "I should have known better," she said. I told her I appreciated it, but I didn't sugarcoat how much her silence had hurt. She nodded, but the conversation felt awkward, like we were strangers trying to find common ground. The rest of my family didn't even try. My brother, who hadn't spoken to me in years, stayed quiet. I heard through my mom that he was still processing everything. I didn't bother reaching out. The hardest part was trying to find work. My old job was gone, and even though the charges were overturned, my name was still tied to the original case in a lot of people's minds. I went to 3 interviews and got turned down each time. One manager actually said, "We don't think you'd be a good fit here," with a forced smile that told me he knew exactly who I was. My lawyer, who had stuck with me through the civil suit, suggested I focus on rebuilding my reputation first. Easier said than done. I started volunteering at a local soup kitchen, partly to stay busy and partly to remind myself that not everyone in the world was against me. The people there didn't ask questions, and for a while, that was enough. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't getting off so easily. The civil case against her was moving forward, and every time I met with my lawyer, I felt like I was chipping away at the mountain she'd built around her lies. She'd been arrested for perjury after the trial, but it didn't stop her from trying to fight the lawsuit. Her lawyer claimed she had acted out of emotional distress, like that was some kind of excuse for ruining my life. Despite everything, there were small moments that gave me hope. A few people in town, people I never expected, came up to me and said they were sorry for believing the rumors. One guy who used to coach my little league team stopped me outside the post office and said, "I should have known better. You were always a good kid." It didn't fix anything, but it reminded me that not everyone had written me off completely. As for my parents, I still couldn't bring myself to see them. My mom kept leaving voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. My dad wrote me a letter, something about wanting to start fresh and rebuild our relationship. I didn't respond. I'm taking it one day at a time right now. It's not perfect, but for the first time in years, it feels like I can breathe. Update 2. Hey again, everyone. I didn't think I'd have more to say after the first update, but some major things have happened since then. A lot of you asked how the lawsuit against Sarah turned out, and I'm finally in a place to talk about it. It took over a year to get everything sorted. Civil cases moved slower than you'd think, and Sarah's lawyer fought tooth and nail to paint her as the victim. They tried everything, saying she had been misunderstood, claiming she was emotionally manipulated, and even throwing in some garbage about how she acted out of fear. None of it worked. My lawyer had the evidence on his side, and he didn't hold back. He presented the Ring camera footage again, the phone records, and the psychological evaluations of the kids' coerced statements. It wasn't a criminal trial, so the burden of proof was lower, but the judge didn't need much convincing. When Sarah finally took the stand, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but something in her demeanor had changed. She didn't have the same confidence she'd had during the first trial. My lawyer pressed her on every inconsistency, forcing her to admit she'd fabricated most of her claims. She tried to cry her way through it, but the judge wasn't buying it. The ruling came in my favor. The court awarded me a settlement that was significant enough to make headlines. It's hard to put into words how I felt when I heard the verdict. I wasn't exactly happy, there's no price tag on what she took from me, but it felt like the world had finally acknowledged the damage she'd done. The money itself didn't mean much to me. I used part of it to cover my lawyer's fees and donated another chunk to an organization that helps the wrongfully accused. With the rest, I decided to start over somewhere new. That was the biggest change, leaving my hometown. After everything that happened, I realized I couldn't rebuild my life there. Too many people still looked at me like I was guilty, even after my name was cleared. I sold most of my stuff, packed what little I had left, and moved to a small city a few hours away. Starting over wasn't easy. I didn't know anyone in the new place, and for the first few months, I mostly kept to myself. But the distance helped. I didn't have to deal with the stares, the whispers, or the awkward apologies from people who had already shown their true colors. I got a job at a mechanic's shop. The owner didn't ask too many questions about my past, just wanted to know if I could show up on time and do the work. I didn't tell anyone about the lawsuit or the prison time. I wanted a fresh start, no labels, no baggage. My family reached out a few times after I moved. My mom sent me a care package with a note that said, "We miss you. Please call." My dad tried to visit once, but I didn't open the door. I wasn't ready to let them back in, not after how quickly they'd turned their backs on me. The strangest part was hearing from people I hadn't spoken to in years. An old friend messaged me out of nowhere, saying he'd heard about the lawsuit and wanted to catch up. I ignored it. I knew he didn't really care, he just wanted the gossip. But not all of it was bad. A woman I met at work, let's call her R, was the first person in a long time who treated me like a normal human being. She didn't pry or ask uncomfortable questions. We got to know each other over lunch breaks and long conversations after work. When I finally told her the whole story, she didn't flinch. She just said, "That's not who you are now." That one sentence stuck with me. I've started volunteering again, this time with a group that supports ex-prisoners trying to reintegrate into society. It's hard seeing how broken the system is, but it feels good to do something meaningful. I've also been working on a personal project, writing down everything that happened, from the night I babysat to the day I walked out of that courthouse a free man. It's not a memoir exactly, just a way to process everything and maybe help someone else in the future. Every day is a mix of moving forward and looking back. I'm not sure I'll ever completely heal from what Sarah did to me, but I'm learning to live with it. For now, that's enough. Commenters. Commenter 1. Your family is trash for not believing you. Blood doesn't mean shit if they can't stand by you. OP. You're right. I'm not sure I'll ever fully forgive them, but I'm trying to move forward. Commenter 2. I'm so sorry this happened to you. You're incredibly strong for surviving that. OP. Thanks. Some days it doesn't feel like it, but I'm trying to keep going. Commenter 3. Did any of your friends ever apologize? OP. A couple did, but most of them just disappeared. It's like I died to them. Commenter 4. How are you doing now? Are you okay? OP. I'm okay. Not great, but better than I was. One day at a time, you know? Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.